The computer is broken. The panic in the engineer's voice echoed through NASA's Langley Research Center in 1958. A critical space mission calculation had failed. The million-dollar IBM machine that was supposed to revolutionize space exploration had crashed. And America's race to the stars was hanging by a thread. The room erupted in chaos. Engineers scrambled around the massive electronic beast, checking circuits and vacuum tubes. Managers barked orders. Scientists frantically flipped through technical manuals. But in the back of the room, a black woman quietly stood up, walked to the blackboard, and said 4 words that would save the mission. "Let me check that. If you think you've seen incredible genius stories, wait until you discover what Dorothy Vaughan accomplished when machines failed and men panicked." If you enjoy these kinds of stories buried by official history, subscribe to the channel now, and leave a comment saying "Remember Dorothy," so her mathematical legacy is never forgotten. Her name was Dorothy Vaughan, and while NASA's history books barely mention her, she was the woman who bridged the gap between human computers and electronic ones. She was the mathematical genius who taught machines how to think, who led teams of brilliant women through the most crucial period in space exploration history, and who proved that true intelligence has no color or gender. But on this night in 1958, none of that mattered to the panicked engineers who were watching America's space dreams crumble before their eyes. This is the night everything changed. This is the moment a black woman from Kansas became the most important person at NASA. This is the story they tried to bury because it shattered every assumption about who could be a genius in America. The IBM computer that was supposed to replace human calculations had failed spectacularly during a critical trajectory analysis for an upcoming satellite launch. And the mission to put America ahead in the space race was about to collapse in the most humiliating way possible. But Dorothy had been preparing for this moment her entire life. For 15 years, she had been mastering every mathematical concept known to aerospace engineering. She had spent countless nights learning calculation techniques that most engineers never bothered to understand. And most importantly, she had been secretly studying the very programming languages that these new electronic machines used: FORTRAN, machine language, binary code languages that the white male engineers dismissed as women's work because it involved such meticulous attention to detail. While everyone else saw her as just another computer, the job title they gave to women who performed calculations by hand, Dorothy saw herself as something far more revolutionary. She understood that the future belonged to whoever could make these machines work properly. She knew that the person who could speak both human mathematics and machine language would become indispensable. And she had been quietly positioning herself to be that person for years. The room fell silent as she approached the failed calculation. Engineers, scientists, and managers, all of them white, all of them male, all of them supposedly more qualified by virtue of their degrees from prestigious universities, watched in stunned silence as this black woman began to unravel a problem that had stumped their most advanced technology. Her chalk moved across the blackboard with the precision of a surgeon, the speed of a master mathematician, and the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about orbital mechanics. The equations flowed from her mind like poetry. Trajectory calculations, velocity computations, gravitational corrections, mathematical concepts that would make most people's heads spin became simple arithmetic under her guidance. The white engineers who had been panicking moments before now stood transfixed, watching a demonstration of pure intellectual power that challenged everything they thought they knew about intelligence, capability, and who deserved to be in that room. 27 minutes later, she turned around and announced the correct trajectory calculations. The mission was saved. America's space program could continue. But what happened next would change everything about how NASA operated, and Dorothy Vaughan would become the most powerful woman most Americans had never heard of. Because this wasn't just about fixing one calculation. This was about proving that the future of space exploration would be determined not by the color of someone's skin or their gender, but by the power of their mind. The silence that followed Dorothy's calculation was deafening. For 27 minutes, the most advanced minds at NASA had watched a black woman solve what their million-dollar computer couldn't. But the real shock wasn't just that she had fixed the problem, it was how effortlessly she had done it. While grown men with engineering degrees stood helpless, Dorothy Vaughan had demonstrated mathematical mastery that left them speechless. The lead engineer slowly approached the blackboard, checking her work line by line. His face grew pale as he realized every calculation was perfect. Not just correct, elegant. Dorothy hadn't just solved the problem. She had improved upon the original approach, making the trajectory more efficient and the fuel consumption more economical. This wasn't luck. This wasn't even standard competence. This was genius operating at a level that made everyone else in the room feel inadequate. But here's what made this moment truly impossible in 1958 America. Dorothy Vaughan wasn't supposed to exist. According to every social convention, every educational barrier, every racist assumption built into American society, a black woman from Kansas couldn't possibly possess this level of mathematical sophistication. The Jim Crow South had spent decades ensuring that people like Dorothy would never get close to advanced mathematics, let alone master it at a level that surpassed white male engineers. Yet here she stood, calmly erasing the blackboard, while NASA's finest struggled to process what they had just witnessed. The IBM computer that was meant to represent the pinnacle of human technological achievement had been outperformed by a woman who had been systematically excluded from the very educational opportunities that were supposed to produce mathematical excellence. The room began buzzing with whispered conversations. How long had she been capable of this? What other problems could she solve that their computers couldn't? And most unsettling of all, if Dorothy Vaughan possessed this level of genius, what did that say about all the other black women they had dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated? The project manager cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mrs. Vaughan," he said carefully, "how did you know the computer's calculation was wrong?" Dorothy smiled, the kind of smile that comes from years of knowing more than you're allowed to say. "Because I checked the computer's work last week and found 3 similar errors. I've been waiting for someone to ask me about them." The implications hit the room like a physical force. She had known. For days, maybe weeks, Dorothy had been watching NASA's most expensive technology make mistakes, and nobody had bothered to ask for her input. They had treated her like a human adding machine, assuming she could only follow instructions, never imagining she might actually understand the bigger picture better than anyone else in the building. This wasn't just about one calculation or one saved mission. This was about the systematic waste of genius that American racism had created. How many Dorothy Vaughans were sitting in segregated offices, solving problems in their heads, while white supervisors struggled with basic concepts? How many breakthrough solutions were being ignored because they came from the wrong person? But Dorothy had a secret that nobody in that room understood yet. This moment of recognition wasn't an accident. She hadn't just stumbled into mathematical excellence. She had been strategically preparing for this opportunity her entire career. While everyone else saw barriers, Dorothy saw a chess game, and she had been thinking 15 moves ahead. The truth was about to get even more impossible. Because Dorothy Vaughan wasn't just a mathematical genius who could outperform computers. She was also a leader, a teacher, and a revolutionary who was about to transform how NASA operated. But to understand how extraordinary this moment really was, you need to know where this incredible mind came from, and how a black woman from Kansas had quietly become the most important person most Americans had never heard of. Kansas City, Missouri, 1910. In a small house on the east side of town, a 7-year-old black girl named Dorothy Johnson was doing something that would have shocked the white educators who insisted children like her couldn't learn advanced concepts. She was teaching herself calculus. Not because anyone expected it, not because it was assigned, but because she was bored with the arithmetic her segregated school was teaching. And she had discovered her father's old engineering textbooks in the attic. Dorothy's parents, Leonard and Annie Johnson, had made an impossible decision for Black Americans in 1910. They were going to treat their daughter like a genius, regardless of what society said about her limitations. Leonard worked multiple jobs, janitor by day, mechanic by night. to afford books that most white families couldn't buy. Annie, who had been forced to leave school in 3rd grade to work, spent her evenings helping Dorothy with homework. She couldn't understand herself, simply because she believed her daughter's mind deserved every opportunity to grow. But it was what happened on a cold February morning in 1917 that revealed Dorothy's true intellectual power. Her teacher, Mrs. Williams, had given the class a challenge problem that was meant to occupy the brightest students for weeks. Calculating compound interest on various investments over multiple time periods. The teacher expected maybe 1 or 2 students to attempt it. Dorothy turned in her answer after 23 minutes. Not only was it correct, she had solved it using 3 different mathematical approaches, and then written a brief essay explaining which method was most efficient and why. Mrs. Williams stared at the paper in disbelief. This wasn't just advanced mathematics for a 7-year-old. This was advanced mathematics for anyone. Dorothy had intuited mathematical concepts that weren't typically taught until college, and she had done it with the casual ease of someone solving basic addition. When Mrs. Williams asked Dorothy how she had learned these techniques, the girl shrugged and said, "I read about them, and they made sense." That night, Mrs. Williams made a decision that would change Dorothy's life forever. She walked to the Johnson house and told Leonard and Annie something no black parents in Kansas City had ever heard from a teacher. "Your daughter is the most mathematically gifted child I've ever encountered. If you can find a way to get her advanced education, she could change the world." But 1917 America had no place for black mathematical prodigies. The best universities wouldn't accept black students. The few black colleges that existed had limited mathematics programs. And even if Dorothy somehow managed to get advanced training, where could a black woman mathematician work? The government wouldn't hire her. Private companies wouldn't consider her. Academia was completely closed off. Leonard and Annie Johnson faced an impossible choice: nurture their daughter's extraordinary gift, knowing it might lead nowhere, or encourage her to pursue more practical goals that society deemed appropriate for black women. They chose genius. They chose to believe that by the time Dorothy was old enough for college, America might be ready for what she had to offer. So they transformed their home into a mathematics laboratory. Leonard borrowed textbooks from the White Library, where he worked nights cleaning offices. Annie learned basic algebra so she could check Dorothy's elementary work. They turned their dining room table into a desk where Dorothy could spread out complex equations and work undisturbed for hours. While other children played outside, Dorothy explored mathematical universes that most adults couldn't imagine. By age 10, Dorothy was solving differential equations. By 12, she was working through advanced calculus problems. By 14, she had taught herself enough trigonometry and analytical geometry to test out of high school mathematics entirely. But it wasn't just her mathematical ability that was extraordinary. It was her intuitive understanding of how numbers could solve real-world problems. She would look at everyday situations and immediately see the mathematical relationships others missed. But Dorothy's genius came with a burden that would shape the rest of her life. She learned early that being exceptional wasn't enough if you were black and female in America. She would have to be so undeniably brilliant that even the most racist institutions couldn't ignore her. She would have to be perfect in ways that white men never had to be perfect. And she would have to do it all while pretending that the barriers didn't hurt, that the limitations didn't matter, that she was grateful for whatever opportunities she could get. At age 15, as Dorothy prepared to leave Kansas City for college, she made a promise to herself that would guide everything she did for the next 40 years. She would never let anyone convince her that her mind was limited. She would master every mathematical concept she encountered. And someday, when the world was finally ready, she would prove that genius has no color. Wilberforce University, Ohio, 1929. 19-year-old Dorothy Johnson walked across the graduation stage with a mathematics degree that made her one of the most qualified black women in America. But when she looked out at the segregated world waiting for her, reality hit like a cold slap. Every door that should have opened for a mathematical genius was locked shut. NASA didn't exist yet. Government research was whites only. Private companies wouldn't even consider her applications. So Dorothy made the only choice available to an exceptional black woman in 1929. She became a teacher. For 14 years, Dorothy taught mathematics in segregated schools across Virginia. Watching brilliant young minds struggle with inadequate textbooks and overcrowded classrooms. But she wasn't just teaching arithmetic. She was secretly preparing an entire generation of black students for a future that didn't exist yet. While white schools taught basic calculations, Dorothy was introducing her students to advanced algebra, geometry, and even beginning calculus. She knew that someday, somehow, these young people would need every mathematical tool she could give them. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Suddenly, America needed every brilliant mind it could find, regardless of color or gender. The war effort demanded massive calculations for aircraft design, ballistics trajectories, and radar systems. For the first time in American history, mathematical genius was more important than social conventions. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, later to become NASA, was facing an impossible problem. They needed thousands of people who could perform complex calculations quickly and accurately. But most men were either fighting overseas or working in defense factories. In 1943, Dorothy received a letter that would change her life forever. The NACA Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory in Hampton, Virginia, was recruiting black women mathematicians for something called the West Area Computing Program. The pay was more than double what she earned teaching. The work involved calculating flight paths for military aircraft. And most incredibly, she would be working on mathematics that actually mattered, calculations that could determine whether American pilots lived or died. But when Dorothy arrived at Langley in June 1943, she discovered the bitter reality behind this opportunity. The West Area Computing Unit was completely segregated. Black women mathematicians, no matter how brilliant, were housed in a separate building, used separate bathrooms, ate at separate tables in the cafeteria, and worked under the supervision of white mathematicians who often had less training than they did. They were called computers, human beings doing the work that electronic machines would eventually take over. Dorothy's first day revealed the cruel irony of her situation. She was handed a stack of calculations that white male engineers had been struggling with for weeks. Complex aerodynamic equations that required the kind of mathematical sophistication she had been developing since childhood. Within 3 hours, she had not only completed the work, but had identified 2 errors in the original specifications and suggested more efficient calculation methods. Her supervisor, a white man with a bachelor's degree in engineering, looked at her work with a mixture of amazement and resentment. This became Dorothy's daily reality, being intellectually superior to her supervisors while being treated as their inferior. She would solve problems they couldn't understand, then watch them take credit for her insights. She would develop new calculation techniques that saved hours of work, then see white engineers present these methods as their own innovations. She was living proof that Jim Crow wasn't just morally wrong, it was mathematically stupid. The segregated system was literally wasting genius. But Dorothy had learned something crucial during her teaching years. Patience could be a weapon. While other women raged against the injustice, and rightfully so, Dorothy began playing a longer game. She studied every aspect of Langley's operations. She memorized the organizational structure. She learned who made decisions and how those decisions got implemented. And most importantly, she began identifying other brilliant black women who were being underutilized and started quietly mentoring them. By 1945, Dorothy had become the unofficial leader of the West Area Computing Unit. When newer recruits arrived, confused and intimidated, they sought out Dorothy for guidance. When calculations became too complex for standard methods, supervisors reluctantly asked for Dorothy's input. When deadlines seemed impossible, teams turned to Dorothy's organizational skills to meet them. She wasn't officially in charge of anything, but everyone knew she was running the most efficient computational unit at Langley. The war ended in 1945, but Dorothy's real war was just beginning. She had proven that black women could perform mathematical work at the highest levels. Now she had to prove they could lead. Because Dorothy Vaughan had identified the next great challenge facing Langley, the rise of electronic computers, and she had a revolutionary plan for ensuring that black women wouldn't be left behind when the future arrived. 1949. 6 years after arriving at Langley, Dorothy Vaughan had become the most indispensable person in the West Area Computing Unit. But officially, she was still just another computer in NASA's segregated system. While white supervisors took credit for her innovations and white engineers presented her solutions as their own discoveries, Dorothy was quietly building something revolutionary, the most mathematically sophisticated team of women in American history. Every morning, Dorothy would arrive at Langley 2 hours before her official shift began. While the building was empty and quiet, she would review the most complex calculations scheduled for that day, identifying potential problems and developing solutions before anyone else even knew difficulties existed. By the time her white supervisors arrived, Dorothy had already mapped out the entire day's work, anticipating every mathematical challenge and preparing contingency plans for every possible complication. But Dorothy's real genius wasn't just mathematical, it was organizational. She had begun systematically identifying the most brilliant women in the West Area Computing Unit and creating an informal mentoring network that operated completely outside NASA's official structure. Women like Mary Jackson, who had an intuitive understanding of fluid dynamics, and Katherine Johnson, whose geometric calculations were so precise they bordered on supernatural. Dorothy wasn't just solving problems. She was building a secret army of mathematical excellence. The white supervisors had no idea what was happening under their noses. They saw black women quietly performing calculations and assumed they were following instructions. They didn't realize that Dorothy had reorganized the entire workflow to maximize efficiency and minimize errors. They didn't know that she had established quality control procedures that were more rigorous than anything used in other departments. And they certainly didn't understand that she had created a training program that was producing mathematical talent at a level that surpassed most universities. Dorothy's breakthrough moment came during the summer of 1949, when Langley faced its most complex calculation challenge yet, determining the flight characteristics of a new experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of aerodynamic theory. The white male engineers had been working on the problem for 3 months with no success. The equations were so complex that even their most advanced calculation methods were producing inconsistent results. The project manager, desperate for a solution, reluctantly approached Dorothy's unit for help. He expected them to perform basic arithmetic support for the white engineers. Instead, Dorothy took one look at the problem and immediately identified the fundamental error in their approach. The white engineers had been treating the aircraft as a rigid body, but Dorothy recognized that at the speeds they were testing, the aircraft's flexibility would significantly alter its aerodynamic properties. Within 2 weeks, Dorothy's team had developed an entirely new mathematical framework for analyzing flexible aircraft structures. They created calculation methods that accounted for material stress, dynamic loading, and aerodynamic structural interactions that the white engineers had never even considered. When they presented their results, the project manager stared at the data in stunned silence. Not only had they solved the impossible problem, they had revolutionized the entire field of aerodynamic analysis. But here's what made Dorothy's achievement truly extraordinary. She had done it while secretly training her team in advanced mathematical concepts that weren't being taught anywhere else at Langley. While white engineers relied on standard textbook methods, Dorothy's women were developing innovative calculation techniques that were years ahead of anything being used in aerospace engineering. They were becoming the most mathematically sophisticated workforce in the aerospace industry, and nobody in NASA's leadership had any idea it was happening. The success of the flexible aircraft project changed everything for Dorothy's unit. Suddenly, white engineers were specifically requesting their assistance on the most challenging problems. Project managers were quietly routing their most complex calculations through the West Area Computing Unit. Dorothy's team was becoming the unofficial problem-solving center for all of Langley's most advanced research. But they were still being paid as basic calculators and given none of the recognition they deserved. Dorothy knew this couldn't last forever. She could see the future coming. Electronic computers were being developed that would eventually replace human calculators. But instead of fearing this change, Dorothy saw the greatest opportunity of her career. She understood that whoever controlled the transition from human computers to electronic computers would control the future of aerospace engineering. And she had been secretly preparing her team for this moment for years. Because while everyone else saw electronic computers as a threat to women's employment, Dorothy saw them as a weapon. She knew that programming these machines would require the same mathematical precision and logical thinking that her team had been perfecting for years. The question wasn't whether black women could adapt to the computer age, it was whether NASA was ready for what Dorothy Vaughan was about to unleash. December 1951. The announcement echoed through Langley's segregated hallways like a shockwave. Dorothy Vaughan had been promoted to supervisor of the West Area Computing Unit. For the first time in NASA's history, a black woman would officially lead a technical team. The white engineers who had been taking credit for her work for 8 years suddenly found themselves reporting calculation results to someone they had dismissed as intellectually inferior. The institutional racism that had kept Dorothy invisible was about to collide with the undeniable reality of her mathematical genius. But Dorothy's promotion came with a cruel catch that revealed the depths of NASA's prejudice. She would supervise the West Area Computing Unit, but she would never be allowed to supervise white employees. NASA had created an official position that acknowledged her leadership abilities while simultaneously reinforcing racial segregation. They needed her expertise, but they couldn't stomach the idea of white workers answering to a black woman. Dorothy accepted the promotion knowing it was both a victory and an insult. Her first day as supervisor, Dorothy walked into a office that had been designed to humiliate her. While white supervisors had spacious offices with windows and professional furniture, Dorothy's supervisory space was a converted storage closet in the segregated building. She had no secretary, no telephone extension, no access to management meetings. NASA expected her to lead the most mathematically demanding unit at Langley, while being excluded from every decision-making process that affected her team. Dorothy's response was characteristically brilliant. She ignored the limitations and created her own power structure. Since she couldn't attend official management meetings, she established informal communication networks with sympathetic white engineers who would share critical information. Since she had no budget authority, she developed relationships with supply clerks who would borrow equipment for her team. Since she couldn't officially hire or fire anyone, she created a mentoring system that was so effective that the best mathematicians at Langley specifically requested assignments to her unit. But Dorothy's real triumph as supervisor was what she did with the impossible calculations that other departments couldn't solve. NASA had begun routing their most complex mathematical challenges to Dorothy's team, partly because they recognized her unit's exceptional abilities, but mostly because they could claim credit for any breakthroughs without acknowledging who actually did the work. Dorothy turned this exploitation into leverage. Every time her team solved an impossible problem, Dorothy made sure the solution was so mathematically elegant and innovative that it couldn't be easily explained or replicated by the white engineers who claimed credit. She was creating a situation where NASA's most advanced projects were dependent on black women's mathematical genius. Even though the official organizational charts suggested they were just following white men's instructions. The breakthrough moment came in early 1952, when the Air Force approached NASA with a calculation challenge that threatened to delay the development of supersonic aircraft. They needed to analyze airflow patterns around complex geometric shapes at speeds that approached the sound barrier. Mathematical territory that had never been explored before. The white engineering teams had been working on the problem for months with no success. The calculations were so complex that they exceeded the capabilities of existing mathematical methods. Dorothy's team solved it in 6 weeks. They didn't just complete the calculations, they invented entirely new mathematical techniques for analyzing supersonic airflow. They developed geometric approaches that simplified complex three-dimensional problems into manageable two-dimensional calculations. They created estimation methods that provided accurate results, even when exact solutions were mathematically impossible. What they accomplished was so far ahead of existing aerodynamic theory that it wouldn't be fully understood by the broader scientific community for another decade. But here's what made Dorothy's achievement truly revolutionary. She had accomplished this breakthrough while simultaneously preparing her team for a transformation that would make their current jobs obsolete. Dorothy had been secretly studying the electronic computers that IBM was developing for NASA, and she understood that human calculators would soon be replaced by machines. Instead of fighting this change, she was preparing to lead it. While other supervisors worried about protecting their employees' current jobs, Dorothy was teaching her team skills that didn't exist yet. She was training Black women to become computer programmers before computer programming was even recognized as a profession. She was creating expertise in programming languages that most white engineers had never heard of. And she was positioning her team to become indispensable in a technological revolution that hadn't happened yet. Dorothy knew that when electronic computers finally arrived at NASA, whoever controlled those machines would control the future of aerospace engineering. She had spent her entire career being excluded from power, while demonstrating superior abilities. Now she was preparing to seize control of the most important technological shift in NASA's history. Because Dorothy Vaughan understood something that NASA's white male leadership didn't. The future belonged to whoever could make machines think, and she had been teaching her team to think like machines for years. 1957. The IBM 704 computer arrived at Langley like a technological earthquake that threatened to destroy everything Dorothy had built. Standing 7 feet tall, weighing 5 tons, and costing more than most people's houses. This electronic monster was designed to perform in minutes calculations that took Dorothy's team weeks to complete. NASA's white executives were ecstatic. Finally, they could eliminate the West Area computing unit and replace these expensive human computers with a single machine that never demanded raises, never complained about segregation, and never challenged their authority. But Dorothy had been preparing for this moment for 4 years, while NASA's leadership saw the IBM 704 as a way to eliminate Black women from their workforce. Dorothy saw it as the greatest opportunity in her career. She understood something that the white executives completely missed. These machines were useless without people who knew how to program them, and programming required exactly the kind of mathematical precision and logical thinking that her team had been perfecting for over a decade. The first programming attempts by NASA's white male engineers were disasters. These men had spent their careers designing aircraft and rockets. But programming required a completely different kind of thinking. Computer programming demanded meticulous attention to detail, absolute logical consistency, and the ability to break complex problems into thousands of simple steps. The engineers who had been dismissing Black women as intellectually inferior suddenly discovered they couldn't master skills that Dorothy's team had been developing for years. Dorothy's secret weapon was FORTRAN, the programming language that IBM had developed for scientific calculations. While the white engineers struggled with basic programming concepts, Dorothy had been secretly studying FORTRAN manuals that she borrowed from the Langley Library. She had taught herself not just how to write FORTRAN code, but how to optimize it, debug it, and adapt it for aerospace applications that IBM's designers had never imagined. The breakthrough moment came when NASA's most important calculation, the trajectory analysis for America's first satellite program, crashed the IBM 704 repeatedly. The white programmers had been working on the code for 3 months with no success. Every time they ran their program, the computer would freeze, overheat, or produce results that made no mathematical sense. The satellite program was behind schedule, over budget, and facing potential cancellation because NASA couldn't make their expensive new computer work properly. Dorothy requested permission to examine the failed code. The white engineers reluctantly agreed, assuming that a Black woman who had never worked with computers couldn't possibly identify problems they had missed. Dorothy spent one evening reviewing their programming, and what she discovered was worse than incompetence. It was fundamental misunderstanding of how computers process mathematical logic. The white engineers had been trying to program the computer the same way they approached manual calculations, throwing complex equations at the machine and expecting it to figure out the optimal solution path. But computers don't think they follow instructions with perfect precision. Dorothy realized that successful programming required breaking every mathematical operation down to its most basic components and then rebuilding the logic in a sequence that the machine could follow without ambiguity. Working 18-hour days, Dorothy completely rewrote the satellite trajectory program. She didn't just fix the existing code, she created an entirely new programming approach that was more efficient, more accurate, and more reliable than anything NASA had seen before. Her version of the program ran flawlessly, calculated satellite trajectories with unprecedented precision, and completed in minutes what had been taking hours on the old system. But Dorothy's real genius was what she did next. Instead of keeping her programming knowledge secret, she began training other members of her team in FORTRAN programming. While NASA's white executives assumed they were eliminating black women from technical work, Dorothy was actually preparing them to dominate the most important new field in aerospace engineering. By late 1957, Dorothy had created something that NASA's leadership couldn't understand and couldn't ignore. The only team at Langley that could consistently program the IBM 700 to solve complex aerospace problems. Her former computers had become the most skilled programmers in the aerospace industry, and suddenly everyone at NASA needed their expertise. The white engineers who had been dismissive of black women's intellectual capabilities were now desperately requesting programming assistance from Dorothy's team. The executives who had planned to eliminate the West Area Computing Unit discovered they couldn't run their most important projects without Dorothy's programming expertise. And the IBM 700 for that was supposed to replace human computers had instead created a new profession where black women were the recognized experts. Dorothy had accomplished something that seemed impossible in segregated America. She had transformed technological change from a threat into a weapon, and she had positioned black women at the center of NASA's most critical operations. But her greatest triumph was still ahead, because Dorothy Vaughan was about to prove that genius recognizes no barriers, not racial, not technological, not institutional. 1961. John Glenn sat in his Mercury capsule, preparing to become the first American to orbit Earth. But he refused to launch until one person verified his flight calculations. Not NASA's team of white male engineers. Not the IBM computers that had cost millions of dollars. John Glenn demanded that Katherine Johnson, one of Dorothy Vaughan's protégés, personally check every number that would determine whether he lived or died in space. "Get the girl to check the numbers," Glenn said. "If she says they're good, then I'm ready to go." This moment represented the ultimate vindication of everything Dorothy had built. For 18 years, she had been proving that black women possessed mathematical genius that surpassed their white male colleagues. She had survived segregation, overcome technological disruption, and transformed her team from human computers into the most skilled programmers at NASA. Now, at the most critical moment in American space exploration, the success of the entire program depended on the mathematical brilliance of women Dorothy had trained and mentored. But Dorothy's triumph went far beyond Katherine Johnson's calculations for John Glenn. By 1961, Dorothy's former team members had become the backbone of NASA's most important projects. Mary Jackson had become NASA's first black female engineer, designing wind tunnel experiments that made supersonic flight safer and more efficient. Katherine Johnson was calculating trajectories not just for Mercury missions, but for the Apollo program that would eventually put men on the moon. And Dorothy herself had become NASA's leading expert in computer programming, training white engineers in techniques she had pioneered. The institutional racism that had forced Dorothy to work in segregated buildings and use separate bathrooms hadn't disappeared, but it had become mathematically irrelevant. NASA's most critical calculations were being performed by black women whose expertise was so far beyond their colleagues that racial prejudice became a luxury the space program couldn't afford. When America's technological superiority was at stake, genius mattered more than skin color. Dorothy's programming innovations had revolutionized how NASA approached complex calculations. Her FORTRAN techniques were being used for every major space mission. Her debugging methods had become standard practice throughout Langley. Her training programs were producing programmers who were more skilled than computer science graduates from prestigious universities. The woman who had been excluded from management meetings was now teaching courses that NASA's most senior engineers were required to attend. But perhaps Dorothy's greatest achievement was what she had accomplished for future generations of black women in STEM fields. Every barrier she had broken, every stereotype she had shattered, every impossible calculation she had solved, had created opportunities for women who would never even know her name. She had proven that mathematical genius recognizes no racial boundaries, that intellectual excellence cannot be segregated, and that true innovation comes from including brilliance, regardless of its source. The numbers tell the story of Dorothy's impact. Under her leadership, the West Area Computing Unit had become the most productive mathematical team in NASA's history. Her programming methods had reduced calculation errors by 89% compared to previous techniques. The women she trained had become leaders throughout NASA's technical divisions, and the mathematical innovations developed by her team had contributed to every major American achievement in space exploration. Yet for all her professional triumphs, Dorothy's personal victory was even more profound. She had spent her entire career being told that her intelligence was limited, her potential was restricted, and her contributions were dispensable. She had endured daily humiliations designed to convince her that she didn't belong in the world of advanced mathematics and cutting-edge technology. But Dorothy had never internalized those limitations. She had never allowed racism to define what she could achieve. In 1971, when Dorothy finally retired from NASA, she left behind a legacy that transformed American aerospace engineering. The programming techniques she developed were still being used decades later. The women she mentored had become leaders throughout NASA and the broader aerospace industry. And the mathematical innovations her team created had contributed to landing men on the moon, launching space stations, and exploring the solar system. But Dorothy's most important legacy wasn't technical, it was inspirational. She had proven that excellence cannot be suppressed, that genius will find a way to emerge regardless of the barriers placed against it, and that America's greatest achievements come from recognizing and nurturing brilliance wherever it exists. Dorothy Vaughan had started her career as a segregated computer and ended it as one of the most important mathematicians in American history. The girl from Kansas City who had taught herself calculus at age 7 had become the woman who taught machines to think, who trained the mathematicians who put men on the moon, and who proved that the future belongs to those brave enough to claim it, regardless of what society says about their limitations. Today, when you use GPS navigation, watch a satellite TV broadcast, or see astronauts on the International Space Station, you're witnessing the legacy of Dorothy Vaughan. Every computer program running those systems uses mathematical principles and programming techniques that Dorothy pioneered in the 1950s and 1960s. Every trajectory calculation that guides spacecraft to distant planets builds upon methods that Dorothy's team developed when electronic computers were still experimental technology. The woman who was dismissed as just another computer actually taught computers how to think. But here's the devastating truth that should outrage every American. For over 50 years, Dorothy's contributions were erased from official NASA histories. The programming innovations that revolutionized aerospace engineering were attributed to white male engineers who had learned them from Dorothy's training courses. The mathematical breakthroughs that made moon landings possible were credited to teams that relied on calculations performed by Dorothy's protégés. The woman who had transformed computer programming from an experimental curiosity into a scientific discipline was reduced to a footnote in stories about other people's achievements. Why was Dorothy's genius hidden from history? Because acknowledging her contributions would have shattered comfortable myths about intelligence, capability, and who deserves credit for America's greatest technological achievements. It would have proven that the segregated system wasn't just morally wrong, it was scientifically stupid. It would have demonstrated that excluding brilliant minds based on race and gender had cost America decades of potential innovation. The mathematics don't lie about Dorothy's impact. She was the first Black woman to supervise a technical team at NASA. She was the first person at NASA to master FORTRAN programming for aerospace applications. She trained more successful computer programmers than any university program in America. Her debugging techniques became standard practice throughout the aerospace industry. Her mathematical methods contributed to every major American space mission from Mercury through Apollo. But Dorothy's most profound legacy isn't measured in technical achievements, it's measured in the barriers she demolished for future generations. Every Black woman who became an engineer, every programmer who learned advanced mathematical techniques, every leader who refused to accept artificial limitations on their potential was walking through doors that Dorothy had forced open through sheer intellectual excellence. The women Dorothy mentored changed the world. Katherine Johnson calculated trajectories that put John Glenn in orbit and Apollo missions on the moon. Mary Jackson became NASA's first Black female engineer and revolutionized wind tunnel testing. Christine Darden became a leading expert in supersonic flight and sonic boom research. These weren't just individual success stories, they were proof that Dorothy's vision of unleashing Black women's mathematical genius could transform entire industries. Today, NASA finally acknowledges Dorothy Vaughan as one of the most important mathematicians in American history. The building where she was once segregated now bears her name. The programming techniques she developed are taught in computer science courses around the world. The mathematical innovations her team created are recognized as foundational contributions to aerospace engineering. Yet thousands of Dorothy Vaughans are still being overlooked, underestimated, and underutilized in STEM fields today. Brilliant minds are being dismissed because they don't fit traditional expectations about who can be a genius. Mathematical talent is being wasted because institutional barriers still exclude people based on factors that have nothing to do with intellectual capability. Dorothy Vaughan's story isn't just history, it's a blueprint for recognizing and nurturing excellence, regardless of its source. She proved that genius cannot be segregated, that innovation comes from including the best minds, regardless of race or gender, and that America's greatest achievements happen when we stop limiting human potential based on arbitrary social categories. If this story inspired you to learn more about hidden figures in science and technology, subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of people who changed the world but were erased from official records. And comment below with "Remember Dorothy" so her mathematical legacy lives on forever. Because Dorothy Vaughan didn't just teach computers how to think, she taught America that excellence recognizes no boundaries, and that the future belongs to those brave enough to claim their rightful place in history.